Shovel Knight is a 2D side-scrolling platform game, developed and published by Yacht Club Games. The initial project was funded by patrons through Kickstarter. After a successful campaign, the game was released on PC, Nintendo 3DS, and Wii U in June 2014. Since that initial release, the game has been ported to OS X, Linux, PlayStation 3, PlayStation 4, PlayStation Vita, Xbox One, Amazon Fire TV, and Nintendo Switch. So it's certainly accessible. 3 additional campaigns were added to the game later on, with the original campaign receiving the retronym Shovel of Hope. Shovel Knight mimics old NES side-scrollers in many ways. In fact, music for the game, composed by Jake Kaufman, was crafted using Famitracker, a program for producing music that could actually be played back on NES and Famicom hardware. The plot of the game focuses on the titular character Shovel Knight, who journeys with his partner Shield Knight. While exploring the Tower of Fate, they come across a cursed amulet, ousting Shovel Knight from the tower with no sign of Shield Knight. After this, Shovel Knight gives up adventuring and goes into self-imposed exile. During his absence, the evil Enchantress rises to power and unseals the Tower of Fate, bringing Shovel Knight out of retirement. After completing a level, Shovel Knight will rest by a campfire. Normally when this happens, you'll hear the track The Starlit Wilds, a soothing track to wrap up a day of adventure. The player is able to collect music sheets throughout the game, and the description of the music sheet for Starlit Wilds reads, "Rest your grieves, toast a marshmallow, and enjoy the starry night." The theme of Starlit Wilds is shared with a few other tracks: One Fateful Night, the Requiem of Shield Knight, the Possessor, and the Betrayer. We'll cover each of those in this video, but we'll start with the Starlit Wilds, as all of the other tracks spring from that one. The Starlit Wilds has an intro and then 2 distinct sections which repeat. If you're listening to the official audio file, here are the timestamps of when each begins for the first time. The track starts with ascending figures played with 2 square waves, soon joined by a few other voices. This short opening is in the key of F-sharp major. After this opening, we actually jump over to the key of A major, where our main melodic material begins. I see the opening as a transition between being awake and being asleep, being whisked from the real world, represented by F-sharp, to the dream world, represented by A. Now that's the basic idea, but there is actually a lot to unpack just from these first few seconds. They set the standards that the rest of the track follows. First, let's talk more about the harmony we hear in these first few seconds. When analyzing these chords, you could actually make pretty strong arguments for labeling them one way or another. Let me show you what I mean. Let's take these notes right here, on the 3rd beat of the track. When analyzing music, sometimes some notes are sounding, but don't serve a harmonic purpose. This is why if you look at chord analyses of, say, a Wagner piece, one analyst might call one chord a certain name, and another analyst might call it something else, both justifying their labels within the context of the overall piece of music. So here on this 3rd beat of the Starlit Wilds, we have these notes which spell out an F-sharp major 7 chord, but we also have these notes which spell out a C-sharp major chord. Now we could stop there and say, hey, this measure is in the key of F-sharp major, of course the F-sharp major chord makes more sense. But let's keep going before jumping to conclusions. On the 4th beat, we have these notes which spell out G-sharp minor 7, and these notes which spell out F-sharp major 7. In the first half of the next measure, where we enter the key of A major, these notes spell out A major, and these notes spell out B minor 7. A major makes sense here since it's the new key, but a lot of the time we can infer important harmonic elements by looking at the melody. It's what catches our ears the most after all. The melody lands on a pretty prominent B note, with the first 2 melodic notes going so fast that they just don't seem as important to the overall harmony. So all of that is to say that there are valid arguments to be made for labeling these chords in different ways. You could almost say 2 harmonic progressions are going on at the same time. To my ear, these conflicting harmonies give the track a little warmth, musically reminiscent of the fireplace Shovel Knight rests by every night. Having so many notes under the melody gives the bass frequencies of this track a little push forward, making the sound warm. Harmonically, the piece continues like this. Lots of notes rubbed together, and one could make valid arguments about different ways of labeling chords. Having multiple progressions means you have multiple resolutions, giving the track an increased sense of harmonic resolution at the end of each phrase. And that makes sense in context. This is sort of home for Shovel Knight, or at least refuge from all the actual levels of the game where he's whacking stuff with a shovel. Let's talk about texture for a bit. You always have static, unwavering notes, which support the melody, and you have some counter-melodic material from the low triangle wave. But you also have a very active line that reminds me of the environment. When this line appears like this, with notes played twice before moving upward, I envision stars twinkling in and out in a night sky, one note for the brightness and one for the fade out. The line also has this figure, which progresses up but not as quickly. Kind of like gentle winds or something to that effect. I'm sure there are other images one could conjure up, but I definitely feel this line is here for atmosphere. And the warmth brought about by the lower frequencies sounding close intervals reminds me of the campfire Shovel Knight rests by. Now let's discuss the melodic material of the section. It's actually pretty reminiscent of famous lullaby music. It's sequential, meaning it follows a similar pattern throughout. You have this big jump up, followed by a step down, and then it just descends note-wise using that pattern. Here are some famous examples of lullabies using repetitive or sequential material. The melody is pretty high compared to the rest of the music under it. Often, lullabies are sung in a high voice to mimic the voice of a baby, and also because babies respond more to high sounds. Where the Starlit Wilds differs is in the harmonic complexity we talked about earlier. Shovel Knight isn't a baby, so while humans of all ages sleep, adults sleeping music needs a bit more complexity because their lives are a bit more complex. Now let's head to the B section of the track. The voice that has been carrying the melody this whole time has joined with the atmospheric line, one providing 16th notes throughout and one providing the same exact material, but offset by the length of this rest, a dotted 16th rest. So it's all the same material, but this offset makes it feel a little bit more like ornamentation than melody. So that leaves us with what was the counter melody from the triangle wave as the primary melodic material. And it flows well because we've been hearing it throughout, but it feels unique at the same time because we weren't paying as close attention to it before. After this section, we loop back to the A section, and that's how the piece proceeds until the player moves on. Now I'd like to talk about this track's connection to the other tracks I mentioned before. One Fateful Night, and that's night with a K, get it? Ha ha ha, is heard as the game's opening sequence is played. You'll hear a medley that also includes the first level's music, but let's focus on the melody we've been talking about. Let's take a listen first. Creepy, huh? The melody is similar to what we've heard before, but now it lingers on this E flat instead of providing any resolution. What's accompanying the melody adds to the creepiness. The top line of that part sounds a D flat augmented chord, and then an E flat augmented chord after that, which both sound gritty as they are. Here are those chords with the notes played simultaneously. Adding to that grit is the bass line. While the D-flat augmented chord is heard, An E-flat note is repeated in the bass, and then when the E-flat augmented chord is heard, a D-flat takes over the bass. So during both chords, you have a harsh rub between D-flat and E-flat. This creepy setting sets the stage early on for Shield Knight's duality with the Enchantress. As I mentioned before, Shield Knight is Shovel Knight's partner, who is separated from him in the Tower of Fate. Occasionally, when Shovel Knight sleeps, he'll dream of Shield Knight falling, which begins a mini-level where Shovel Knight must fend off enemies and catch her. When this happens, instead of the Starlit Wilds, you'll hear the Requiem of Shield Knight. The Requiem of Shield Knight is much slower to progress than the Starlit Wilds. Notes linger around a lot longer, and some of them are very low notes compared to what we heard in the Starlit Wilds. The track sits in F-sharp minor, mainly, instead of obscuring the harmony like in the Starlit Wilds. It's also worth noting that the Starlit Wilds started in F-sharp major, which I read as representing the real world, as opposed to the later dream world. And this one starts and stays in the parallel minor, F-sharp minor, like reality and dreams are coming together in a sad way. The melody is the same for the most part, and a lot of the other material we talked about from the Starlit Wilds appears here. For example, this track has the same kind of twinkling effect, but here it's made of much more repetitive material, as opposed to the rapid flurry we got in the Starlit Wilds. There are also poignant moments where the melody goes quiet and then bursts back out, like here for example. The Starlit Wilds was pretty static dynamically. It kinda just sat at the same level throughout. But this music isn't just for scenery. It's more related to characters than environment, and so putting dynamic shifts feels representative of Shovel Knight's anguish, or perhaps his restlessness due to how it goes in and out, crescendos and decrescendos. So while the harmonies and melodies are much more static in the Requiem of Shield Knight, the dynamics are much more fluid. Like Shovel Knight is staying in the same place mentally, but still reeling in his emotions or his restlessness all the same. The track The Possessor plays during the first phase of the final boss battle against the Enchantress. At this point, Shield Knight is still possessed by the Amulet of Fate, hence the title, and Shovel Knight is trying to get her back. The track combines elements of the main theme of the game and the two aforementioned tracks, and adds some creepy vibes. Because Shield Knight is still not free at this point, and in a way fighting Shovel Knight, the music isn't happy or even somber, but haunting with a sense of urgency. Focusing in on the melody from the Starlit Wilds and the Requiem of Shield Knight, this haunting, urgent vibe comes from the dissonant harmonies surrounding the melody, and the melody and harmony's timings. Instead of the longer notes of the melody landing on predictable beats within a simple 4/4 pattern like before, here they land at different and unexpected times. Like, if I were to put this into a fast 5/4 time, this is how it would stack up to the same material in the Starlit Wilds. And new chords accompany each of these landings, instead of the repetitive surrounding material we were used to from the other tracks, which obscures the sense of time and tonality even more. And the ending of the melody is repeated in different octaves, like something looming over the player. The track The Betrayer plays right after the Possessor in the game, and serves as the battle music for the second and final form of the Enchantress. After the first phase, Shield Knight is freed from possession and able to help Shovel Knight in this final battle. The Possessor was an eerie remix/medley of the main theme in the Starlit Wilds melody, and The Betrayer is an upbeat remix of that. This track features more of the Starlit Wilds melody than the Possessor. You'll hear it after the first few seconds, and when you do, you can hear the melody is landing on the same beats as the Starlit Wilds in the Requiem of Shield Knight, as opposed to how it landed in the Possessor. Let's listen to that phrase again, and pay special attention to the ending. Instead of the looming repeat of the ending of the melody we just talked about in the Possessor, here the phrase ends with new ascending material that sounds more like a fanfare. And now let's listen to the following phrase, which obscures the sense of rhythmic pulse kind of like the Possessor did, but with less eerie sounding music and more uplifting material in its place. Skipping to 1 minute and 5 seconds into this track, you can hear that the timing of the landings is changed again, and it fits into 4/4 time. It has a much more confident character this time around, and adding to this is the way the phrases end. In the Starlit Wilds, Requiem of Shield Knight, and the Possessor, the phrases of the A section end on the tonic note, and it holds steady until the next phrase. Here in the Betrayer, it lands on the tonic, but before the end of the phrase, bumps up to the next note in the scale, and then the next phrase is the same melody, but up a half step, and with an ending that returns us to the previous tonic note, F. Well, E sharp the way I wrote it, but it's the same sound. On the whole, this track is representative of both the epic nature of the final battle and the excitement of the reunion with Shield Knight. As you can see, Kaufman is able to take the same material and play with it in slightly different ways to evoke different emotions, which really makes the theme an earworm since you hear it so often. But it's different enough each time that it never felt tiring to me. To have a theme that works in all of these different contexts with only small modifications that doesn't get tiring to the listener means that the foundation of the theme has to be solid, and I think Kaufman nailed that here. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.